Hello everyone, and welcome to the latest instalment of our Rural Health webinar series. This webinar will be facilitated by Dr. Ken Winkle and will reflect on the lessons he has learnt from 20 years of on-call toxinology service work, addressing venomous bite and sting queries from rural, remote and metropolitan Australia, as well as internationally. We'd just like to start with an acknowledgement of country. RACGP would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which this event is being broadcast, and we pay our respects to their elders past, present, and emerging. RACGP Rural would also like to thank our sponsor, Okra Health and Recruitment. Established and still owned by 2 procedural GPs, they operate a network of medical centres around Australia, as well as operating a medical recruitment agency that works with hospitals and medical practices throughout Australia and New Zealand to source and place locum and permanent doctors across a wide range of specialties. We greatly appreciate their support of this webinar series. Finally, before we start, there are a few housekeeping things to cover. All participants are on mute to ensure that the webinar is not disrupted by background noise, but we encourage you all to use the chat function to ask questions and provide comments, and there will also be a few polls during the webinar. Finally, this webinar has been accredited for 2 CPD points, and in order to gain these points, you must be present for the duration of the webinar. We also ask that you complete the evaluation activity that will pop up at the conclusion of the webinar. Thank you, everyone, and I will now hand over to our facilitator, Dr. Ken Winkle.
Thank you very much, Amy. And I think I will switch on my slides by sharing my screen. Okay, so hopefully everybody can see that. Welcome this evening. I hear it's a good-sized audience, and presumably you're all from different parts of Australia with different experiences, lesser or more, in respect of envenomation management. So I will try to tell you some stories, provide some education, and hopefully have a conversation with you about this very broad topic. Spend a lot more time talking about the various issues around the management of all the different bites and stings. So this will be a broad sweep, but particular focus on the issue of snakebite, but particularly reflecting on some of the lessons I've learned from my time as an on-call consultant over the years, where it's a never-ending story, the understanding and the optimal management of snakebite and of other venomous bites and stings. Not just because each creature has its own venomous complement, but because each particular story has its own quirks. But there are broad themes, broad principles that we can discern that perhaps will help you when you come across a case, whether it's a bee, wasp, ant, tick, snake bite, land snake, sea snake, or fish or other creature. So these broad principles that you can be aware of without knowing all the fine-grained details of every creature, and that hopefully they will prevent you running into them. And I assure you, even experts from time to time can come to some grief. But provided you apply the broad principle to be safe, to be conservative, then you should really minimise the trouble that you might run into. And so this, this title is a little bit tongue-in-cheek, but actually we will touch on each of these particular topics because they do tell us a little bit about venomous bite and sting management and mismanagement. So hopefully you're not too phobic about seeing some creature features, because we're certainly going to feature a few of those today. For those of you who are not familiar with my story, well, I'm a University of Queensland medical graduate, a fellow of the Australasian College of Tropical Medicine, and I've done a PhD down at the Walter and Eliza Hall Institute after I completed my internship at Royal Brisbane Hospital. After completing my PhD in immunology, I spent many years as the director of the Australian Venom Research Unit at the University of Melbourne, following in the tremendous footsteps of Struan Sutherland. And as part of that time, I was a consultant to CSL, now known as Securus, the various poison centres, and the Divers Alert Network Asia Pacific. Spent time teaching into various courses, including, if you know, the remote vocational training scheme for rural remote GP trainees. Perhaps some of you have heard me before. Hopefully I won't be too repetitive if you have. And the old Victorian Medical Postgraduate Foundation lecture series, then turned into the Health Education Limited series. Like to talk to the first aid providers, the community outreach. Very important part of the story of envenomation is what happens pre-hospital. Experience with the first aid for life people and the other primary healthcare providers. The College of Rural Remote Medicine. I've worked with my colleague Bill Nimmo, the emergency physician. Some years ago, we developed the Teletox module. If you've ever seen that in the Akron Romeo site, I'm not sure that it's active anymore. We haven't updated that for a while. Sunshine Health in Queensland, we've had courses with them, the MCOR people, and various other places, including, I particularly enjoy teaching into the hyperbaric medicine, the diving medicine community, because there's always something interesting that'll come out of the audience. And hopefully I'll hear something interesting that can educate me from your experience this evening. And of course, I followed on from Struan Sutherland, who over many years made so many contributions to the understanding and management of venomous injury in Australia, but particularly the bequest really of the pressure immobilisation technique, combining firm pressure bandage, immobilisation and splinting to block the movement of venom from the periphery centrally through the lymphatics, to stop the clock, essentially, give us time without applying a tourniquet, so safely blocking the movement of most venom into the central circulation, giving time for movement of the patient, assemblage of appropriate management, assessment of the signs, the symptoms. We may talk about that with the Q&A. There's lots of issues embedded in there and how you can make mistakes. But in general, as soon as possible, the patient should get pressure immobilisation. That's pressure bandaging plus immobilisation, ideally using the lymphatic compression bandages, these newer compression bandages. They're way better than what is depicted here by Struan in the late 1970s using the old crate bandages, which provide really inconsistent and unreliable pressure. So Struan gave me the opportunity, and I spent quite a few years building on his legacy at the university. Now I'm in the School of Population Health, working more broadly in public health. So I guess just to kind of start off, what is the first rule of Venom Club? Well, from a venomous creature, the point of view is to eat and not be eaten. So these venoms that we're going to talk about have been shaped by millions of years of evolution in a kind of constant warfare, if you like, an arms race with their prey. So most of the time, the story out of this is that these venoms have great redundancy. They have multiple ways of forming toxicity because that's shaped by evolution to knock down their prey and readily start digesting it. But some venoms are really not about prey capture and digestion. They're about defense. So your bees, your wasps, your ants, very familiar to us as a noxious stimulus, but usually won't be a threat to life. But the whole topic of venom allergy we'll briefly touch on, but is one which is almost equivalent in numbers in terms of morbidity and mortality in Australia compared to snakebite. So not to be underestimated, the story of venom allergy. And there's some interesting new twists on that story with the ticks and the red meat, if we've got time to talk about that. So today, now I had listed here that we're going to talk about marine and terrestrial envenomation syndromes, and we will, but the overwhelming concentration, but simply for time purposes, is to talk about the issue of snakebite. But fear not, we will talk about marine and other terrestrial envenomation syndrome, but we're really constrained in time, so we will highlight the principles around management, the potential hazards and mismanagement features by using the prism of snakebite issues, and also highlight the key resources that are available to help you in the management of these particular creatures. So first of all, I'd like to kind of start off really by acknowledging that we have a limited understanding. Actually, wherever you go when you're probing the issue of medicine and the boundaries of medicine, we'll find that we have a limited understanding. So with snakebite, the simple thing of even understanding every toxin in every major venomous snake in Australia, we haven't done that. We aggregate, we can understand the broad toxicities, but we don't have an understanding of every toxin. And we know that every single snakebite will have a mix of different toxins. So you won't have precisely the same mix of neurotoxins, myotoxins, procoagulants with any given snakebite. So that adds a little bit of a frisson of complexity, because every individual snakebite will represent the intersection of that complement of venoms at that point in time with that venomous creature and that person, their background prior history, the ambient conditions. Is it a hot day? Have they got a hyperdynamic circulation? Or is it that this is in the evening, they're sitting, not doing anything, so you've got a very different circumstance. What about that snake? What has its previous activities for that day been? How many bites has it already done that day in prey seeking versus defense? So all these things contribute to the complexity of the envenomation syndrome. Doesn't mean we don't have broad principles, but it just says we don't fully understand everything. And we find new species from time to time. We find new understandings of different species. And we can talk about some of those continuing mysteries, if you like. But just to say that back in 1929, the Medical Journal of Australia thought that was it. We knew all there was to know about snakebite. There was a special edition of the journal highlighting the work at the Walter and Eliza Hall Institute in the late 20s, early 30s, around trying to better understand the toxins, the pathology they caused, and optimize management of snakebite. So we continue almost 100 years later on the same journey. We still haven't closed the book of venom just yet. So the Venom Club that we have in Australia, these are some of the main creatures to talk about. And funnel web spider syndrome, charismatic spider, so to speak, in general, we almost consider that a solved problem. The funnel web spider antivenom made in rabbits, uniquely in the world, very effective at stopping the progress of this neurotoxic spider bite envenomation. The pressure immobilization technique, just as relevant. So those two things combined have revolutionized the management of funnel web spider bite. Still, potentially a very dangerous spider, a big black hairy spider, east coast of Australia. Redback spiders, somewhat more contentious than the antivenom, but still we have got a pretty good antivenom. There's clearly debate about whether that should be given to most patients or what proportion of patients, but I think there's still is relatively gentle envenomation syndrome. It's still neurotoxic compared to the funnel web spider. I'll just check on the Q&As to see whether there's any problems. No, and we'll come back to those questions. So just get rid of those. In that arachnid club, if you like, we also have the very important topic of the paralysis tick. Now, I mentioned the paralysis tick not because it's killing particularly many people. It is a rare cause of death these days, but because it combines multiple forms of toxicity in a way that is uncommon for the various venomous creatures of Australia. So tick bite can kill through paralysis, the toxic action, as it's neurotoxin, slowing the release of neurotransmitter. It can kill through venom allergy, directly tick paralysis, venom allergy, causing anaphylaxis after attachment in a sensitive patient. But also now we know there is the problem of the side effect, if you like, of sensitizing to certain glycoproteins that are present in the tick saliva to mammalian meat glycoproteins, thus causing potentially lethal mammalian red meat allergy. So tick bite's got a combination there. And on top of that, it also has the potential in Australia and elsewhere to cause lethal infections. Also minor local traumatic injury. But the infective side, tick typhus, is still a live issue, so to speak, in Australia. But in other parts of the world, we have tick-borne encephalitis, not caused by this particular species, but when you're thinking about patients going overseas, travel medicine, then very much your patient should be aware of the problem of, if they're going out in Eurasia into the countryside, the issue of tick-borne encephalitis. And there is a vaccine for this infective this infection. But in other parts of the world, there are hemorrhagic fevers in Africa, in the Middle East, that are also borne by ticks. So not to underestimate the tick. So we have, of course, the tick, with the tick allergy, we have with bees, wasps, ants, also the allergy issue. Not to be underestimated, but we won't reflect much on that tonight. Then you have the various marine creatures out there, blue-ringed octopus, a neurotoxin, CPR, expired air resuscitation, ventilation, intensive care. There is no antidote, but the good news is it's just got a sodium channel blocker that will basically shut down the respiratory drive, and within 24, 48 hours, if the patient is adequately oxygenated, supported in hospital, they will recover without other sequelae. Then we have the sea snakes, pretty much the same story as the tiger snakes, with some small variations there, but we have antivenom for the sea snake, and in theory you could use the polyvalent if really necessary, but it's pretty uncommon in venomation. But we will highlight something about that story, because the first aid is exactly the same as our land snakes. Pressure immobilization, get your patient so they can stop the clock on the movement of the venom, get them to where they can be assessed, signs and symptoms monitored, antivenom is necessary. Of course, we have some peculiarities like the platypus. No antivenom, extremely painful, and we still don't fully understand that pain syndrome. But not lethal to us, but potentially lethal to pets, particularly dogs who may harass them. Then we've got things like, of course, the snake bites. We will spend more time on that. That is the coastal taipan that featured there. But amongst the other marine creatures, just to mention, and we will come back to some of those, of course, the famous stingray is responsible for the death of Steve Irwin. But stingrays and stinging fish are responsible for a major burden, probably in rural tropical medicine practice. It's probably, after jellyfish stings, the leading cause of hospital admissions from marine envenomations in Australia. So traumatic injury, risk of infections, big issue with the fish stings, whether it's a stingray, and there's that emergency for any abdomen or chest stingray barb exposures. But we've got plenty of other stinging fish that more tend to cause problems around the ankles, and the issue of infection is really paramount there. So good wound toilet, always part of the story when you're thinking about any kind of venomous bite and sting. And then corals, all kinds of marine injuries that we could spend a week on. And if you're interested in diving medicine, I recommend you get into that topic, because it's a fascinating world of the marine venomous creatures. But let's move along. Okay, so other resources. So there's a very good antivenom handbook put out by CSL. This is to help guide the selection of antivenom, the appropriate use of antivenom, but it provides a wealth of education around the syndromes, distinguishing them, the use of the snake venom detection kit, ancillary laboratory investigations, and tools beyond the antivenom themselves. But mostly it's about educating the clinician in the use of appropriate use of antivenom. And you can get that online via this link. There are courses. I personally did the Swiss Tropical Institute course before there was one course in Australia. Julian White in Adelaide runs from time to time a short course over it's usually a couple of days to a week, covering the broad range of topics. So if you want to dive in, learn some more, I recommend that course. And of course, all the poison centres available 24 hours a day. That's your kind of your number one resource. Do not hesitate to call the poison centre to seek advice. And of course, the poison centres have extensive resources for education on their websites too. And the Australian government, Health Direct, has a lot of material. Beyond that, what's happening here? Okay, of course, basic first aid. If nothing else, apply your basic first aid principles to the management of venomation. When we're thinking about things like box jellyfish sting, allergy to bees, wasps, ants, this is critical. Makes all the difference. Pre-hospital can make all the difference. So that's nothing different to what you already know. There is an app that we produced with CSL, now Securus, which you can get for free via the various app stores. This is just a little link. You can go to the Securus website and find the link there, or go via the kind of Google app stores. And of course, the first aid story. Continuing debates about some of the place of the different first aid. Won't get into it too deeply unless you kind of want to spend some time there, but the Australian Resuscitation Council regularly revisits, looks at the highest quality of evidence to inform the first aid recommendation. So that information available to you via these links. And of course, CSL, who provide these antivenoms, are available 24 hours. And from time to time in the past, I have rung them up to get a restocking situation organised, particularly when you've got an unusual antivenom or you've got a country hospital that's had a particular demand. So CSL, don't hesitate to talk to them as well. They have their own consultant, Julian White being one of them, as well as access to antivenom if you're a hospital wanting urgent replacement of stock. Variety of articles out there. This is one of the obvious recent reviews put together by Jeff Isbister out of Newcastle and his team, who've been doing snakebite studies for some time now. Mostly agree with that. The contention is about the number of vials, how late and how many, which we can talk about. Here's a couple of recent articles that are kind of raising issues there from emergency medicine, from my colleague Jim Tibbles in anaesthesia intensive care. So just like in 1929, there's actually a continuing debate about some of these things. But in the very least, pick up the phone, seek your advice from your expert consultant, and be conservative, keep the patient in, monitor the patient, and rather give antivenom than not give antivenom if circumstances warrant it. So do not hesitate to give antivenom if it's indicated. And this is another article by my colleagues out of South Australia, questioning the proposal by Jeff Isbister that, well, one antivenom is universal for everything. I think that's a bit aggressive. So in terms of the venom effects that we're interested in, there's always some local effects, systemic toxicity, allergy issues and infection. So that's your broad principle for any venomous bite and sting, land and sea. But with respect to Australian snake bites, clearly we're more concerned about systemic toxicity, the risk of death from neurotoxicity or coagulopathy or rhabdomyolysis. The major preoccupation these days has been coagulopathy from snakebite, browns, tigers, taipans, but the brown snake doesn't have really the clinically significant neurotoxicity. So if you're in an area like I am here in Victoria, where you've got tiger snakes as the leading cause of hospital admission and death from snakebite, tiger snakes, unlike the brown, have prominent and potentially lethal neurotoxicity and myotoxins. The taipans, Queensland, up in the Territory, just into New South Wales, they also have those similar issues. But in Victoria, tiger snake, not the brown snake, is the leading cause of death. And it's got that complex mix of pre- and post-synaptic neurotoxins, myotoxins, and the you've got the procoagulants, myotoxins, and the pre- and post-synaptic neurotoxins. So any of these creatures, should mention, can, in the right population, complicate your picture with allergy. I mention that not because you expect to see snake venom allergy often, but certain groups of people, and in some of your communities, even in rural Australia, you will see people who keep snakes. I know Bendigo, Ballarat, down Latrobe Valley, Gosford, and in regional South Australia, at the very least, we have people who keep snakes exotic to their locality and the state. And from time to time, illegally, snakes that are exotic to Australia. So there is always a risk that you may have in your community someone who has repeated exposure to snakes, that's snake bite, snake venom, and snake antivenom. So they've got a more complicated story and could present with a picture that is actually mostly snake venom allergy. And snake venom allergy can kill these snake keepers. And internationally, it's an important part of the story of snake keeper injury from snake bite is the allergy side of things. And your keepers in zoos are a particular legitimate example of those keepers who have a high risk of allergy to the snake venom, who may present with venom anaphylaxis. And there can be cross-reaction. I have a colleague who was bee venom allergic and got a snake bite. She had nothing to do with venomous world, but inadvertently she got a snake bite and had an anaphylactic reaction. So you can have cross-reaction of people who have allergy to the phospholipases in bees, wasps, ants, and some of those snakes, like the tiger snake, like the black snakes, that do also have phospholipases. It's pretty rare, but part of the story. Infection. So any I've got a slide of a patient whose snake bite was complicated by tetanus. This was a patient who had an incomplete tetanus immunisation history, and people didn't think about it. That did this person need coverage? So in theory, you can get tetanus from a snake bite in Australia. But internationally, people are more concerned with kind of gangrene, complicating, necrotizing snake bite. Pretty unusual story for Australia. We're more worried about systemic toxicity, the local effects, the category number 1, which are a major issue for Africa, Asia, and the Americas, where they are worried about limb sparing rather than neurotoxicity and respiratory paralysis. We do have some local effects, some degree of mild and potentially necrosis from some of our black and tiger snakes. Very unusual for anything else like the death adder. Maybe a little bit with the Taipan, but it's really the black tiger type snakes that might do something like that, but nothing like the snakes in Asia, Africa, and in the Americas. So we, as part of the learning outcomes, raise the question of snakebite hazards, management hazards of envenomation. So what are those kinds of things that I've seen from my experience? Well, starting back at the first European description of these snakes, we misunderstood some of what was dangerous, what was not dangerous. And depending on which period you look at, people really didn't think much of a hazard of brown snakes until really later in the 20th century. It was the tiger snake that was the top dog or the top snake in this poster produced by Professor McCoy, who was the inaugural director of the museum here in Victoria. So over time, we've come to appreciate different snakes having different hazards to humans. But still, mistakes are easy to make because we know that snakes look like each other. We have in Australia problems with deciphering which snake is which. We've got the snake venom detection kit to help us with that. We've got broad spectrum snake antivenom to cover every base anyway. Here's an example of a case I was called Nambour Hospital in Queensland. So I was called by Nambour Hospital Emergency Department about a gentleman who had gone collecting. He was a naturalist, photographer. He had gone collecting snakes, and he was wanting to photograph this particular snake, and he thought he was dealing with this snake, the keelback snake, which looks pretty similar to this snake, the rough scale snake. This snake, essentially harmless from a venom point of view, the keelback snake. This snake, very dangerous, potentially lethal, has been known to kill people. So he was in the process of collecting this snake, what he thought it was this snake. He was bitten by the snake. He thought it was harmless. He actually literally put it into a bottle for photography, and he brought it into the Nambour Hospital Emergency Department because when he was at home photographing this snake, which he thought was a harmless keelback, he collapsed. Classic effect of the procoagulant venoms with Australian snakebite. Pre-hospital collapse. So he recovered. He was lucky. And he brought in the snake. Now, there's an extra twist on this tale. So that snake was alive and well, and looking at the clinicians as they rang me, they rang me particularly because clearly he was bitten by a snake. They had the snake. The fang marks were there. It was actually oozing blood from the puncture mark. They swabbed that bite site, put it through the venom test, and it was negative. So they rang me. What was the story here? Why did I think this guy who was clearly clinically envenomed by this snake species, why was this venom test telling it was them that was negative? And I said, okay, this may be a case of a lot of venom present at the bite site. This snake can produce a lot of venom, decent sized fangs. And in fact, they then took a drop from that little bottle that was used to put the venom into the venom detection kit for the assay, put that one drop into another bottle. So they diluted essentially 1 in 30, did the test, and they then got a positive for tiger snake, which tiger snake antivenom is the antivenom to use for this rough scale snake. So it's quite similar, the venoms with procoagulants, neurotoxins, myotoxins. So that particular snake demonstrated the limitations of the snake venom detection kit, which is to say, if the patient is clinically envenomed, they need an antivenom, then treat the patient. You're not treating the snake venom detection kit. But the snake venom detection kit did actually then tell them, yes, this is a tiger type snake and antivenom is the appropriate one there. And this photograph of me at Melbourne Zoo is just illustrating that there are lots of different snakes that kind of mimic each other, that overlap. So we have many brown coloured snakes in Australia, but you can have brown species of snakes which are not brown coloured. So coloration can be unreliable, mistaken identity. And from the title, I was talking about worms. And in theory, you can get someone given antivenom after not even a snake bite, but a confusion for a snake bite. This is an example of a Burton's legless lizard. You may have come across them in the bush. Easy, without looking too closely, to think that's a snake. In fact, it's a non-venomous creature. It's a legless lizard. And there has been, I'm aware of a patient from South Australia who was retrieved by the Royal Flying Doctor Service, who received polyvalent antivenom for lizard bite, because one of these creatures was actually killed and brought along. So it was retrospectively then formally identified that the patient retrieved and given polyvalent antivenom by the Flying Doctor Service in South Australia actually received antivenom for no good reason. And this raises the point that patients can present, if they think they've been bitten by a snake, quite anxious. They may be nauseated, maybe tachycardic and feeling quite anxious, maybe get a headache, mimicking some of the non-specific features of early envenomation by a legitimate venomous snake. And similarly, in theory, you could get some of our large worms causing that kind of problem. But it's absolutely the case that this legless lizard bite has triggered some clinicians at the moment the uncertainty of giving antivenom for the non-specific features that is actually not an indication for snakebite. It's the specific end organ toxicity is the indication for snakebite. And then there's other examples. So this is a snake that was captured, I think actually intercepted at Melbourne Airport. So there are people who bring in exotic snakes to Australia. This is the kind of underground zoo, so-called. So there was a case I heard about from a colleague from the Royal North Shore Hospital in Sydney. It didn't actually bite anyone, but a case of a man who bought, unknowingly, one of these snake species in a pub in Cabramatta. So this gentleman bought this snake thinking it was a non-venomous python. And he took it home, had it at home, kids played with it, and one day it just was not behaving as it normally did. He thought, okay, something wrong with the snake, took it to the vet. And the vet said, well, I don't know what species of snake this is, but I do know this is not a non-venomous python. This is it looks like a dangerous venomous snake. So he called the zoo, Taronga Zoo in Sydney. The keeper came out and identified the snake as Russell's viper, a very dangerous viper from Asia, for which there is not standard antivenom kept here in Australia. It's only some of the venom research laboratories that may have some of this exotic snake specific antivenom. So that is just an exemplar of how confusion in identification of species can occur, and it potentially could be very dangerous in Australia. And there are some other examples of kind of less, in one way, more banal, but still potentially lethal. So there was a case of a gentleman who apparently was bitten by what in the textbooks is regarded in Victoria as a non-venomous snake, the little whip snake in Victoria. And this gentleman died, I think it was February 2007 in Victoria, after being bitten by this ostensibly non-venomous snake. So what does that mean? Well, actually, I did some venom testing from a sample from that patient, and it was positive for tiger type snake. So the snake was actually literally thrown away, so we'll never know. But ostensibly, he identified it as this little whip snake. And in theory, he could have had a venom allergic reaction. And so there is the risk of even ostensibly minimally toxic snakes triggering potentially lethal allergic reactions. And there are past cases in Australia of definite fatal venom allergy. It's pretty rare, but in the snake keepers, collectors population, there is a risk of a fatal allergic reaction, even potentially to some of these less toxic snakes that otherwise would be regarded really as harmless. And there has been a case written up in the textbooks, and I think it was in the Medical Journal Australia, of another snake that mostly the snake experts will tell you, it's mostly harmless. So this is the white-lipped snake here in Victoria, kind of alpine type snake. And the case in the textbooks was of an example of this snake that bit a woman. I think the patient ended up in Wangaratta Hospital with basically a tiger type snake envenomation. They literally had the snake and confirmed that this was a case of systemic toxicity from what had never been recorded before as a cause of systemic toxicity. People have done venom studies, molecular studies recently, and demonstrated the congruity, if you like, between this particular snake's venom and that of the tiger snake, and tiger snake antivenom is the appropriate one, which was given. But most of your snake keepers will tell you, now this is harmless, like a bee sting. But this was, and it's a small snake with very little venom. But in the wrong size snake, the wrong size patient, the right location, the right bite, potentially dangerous. So this is just raising the question that there are a range of snakes that you might otherwise not hear much about, but in the wrong circumstances can be dangerous. You may have heard of this case. Another case of mistaken identity. This man, really a contender for the Darwin Award, was bitten 9 times, and he was aware of it, 9 times by the most toxic of our black snakes, the mulga snake. So the problem is, this mulga snake, he thought, just like that guy in the pub in Cabramatta, Sydney, he thought he was dealing with a non-venomous snake, and he had drunk some alcohol, too much amber fluid, so his judgment was impaired, and he had 9 bites, I think it was, from this snake, which he collected, taking it as a favour, he thought, to the local pub, to keep it in the terrarium they had there. He thought, this would be good, get a python for the pub. In fact, so he ignored the fact that he was bitten multiple times, and he was bitten by the most venomous of our black snakes that's chock full of these inflammatory venoms that digest the muscle tissue, cause rhabdomyolysis. And it's very unusual to cause life-threatening neurotoxicity, but certainly rhabdomyolysis, quite a well-recognised feature of the mulga snake bite. So he spent 7 weeks in a coma and had to have dialysis for his renal failure after incredibly severe case of rhabdomyolysis, which, in unprecedented complication, meant that he needed left arm amputation because of the continued oozing and problems with the rhabdomyolysis. So very unusual, but just to illustrate that we can have some severe complications, and patients can be their own worst enemy, and misunderstanding the nature of the snakes, and even doctors can make that mistake. So these are different stories. One of a Northern Territory woman, definitely bitten by the leading cause of death from snakebite in Australia, the brown snake, but she thought, it's only a flesh wound, just a scratch. It's not a bite proper. So she continued to make a cake until she started to feel unwell. She could have collapsed at home and died. And people don't appreciate that brown snakes, the bite site may actually be practically invisible, and you're not going to see a complication necessarily there at the bite site, even in a fatal case. And this gentleman here was bitten by a red-bellied black snake, decapitated head. Not the first decapitated head that could cause an envenomation. And again, people underestimate the fact that snakes, even when they're deceased, decapitated, have that biting response, which can cause potentially a lethal envenomation syndrome. Pre-hospital management. The patient, very important part of the story. How early do we first get first aid? But ambulance services, rural health communities, rural health services sometimes misunderstand what is completely adequate first aid. And we can see here, complete pressure immobilization. And here is this patient from Wodonga Hospital, I think, who was bitten by a tiger or copperhead. Here he is in the ward, still got his boot on, incomplete first aid. See those two different bandages. So we've still got a long way to get the message out to our colleagues about what is the full appropriate first aid for some of these snakes. And then, of course, it is a challenge. This is a post-mortem photograph from the Victorian Institute of Forensic Medicine, illustrating post-mortem signs of pediatric tiger snake bite. This was a fatal case, unrecognised ante-mortem. I ended up in the coroner's court in Geelong talking to the court about the management, but also the recognition and the difficulties you can initially get, particularly in children who may not recognise they've been bitten by a snake, and the progression of the syndrome over hours, particularly with a tiger snake, where you may have complications predominantly of neurotoxicity that may take 10 more hours to be obvious. This child died in his sleep of neurotoxicity from tiger snake bite. It was unrecognised, and he was in Apollo Bay Hospital, but unfortunately, there was no story of snake bite. So in children who suddenly become unwell, particularly with a collapse on an afternoon in a tiger snake area, just take the time to have a good look. Could they have a bite site? What about, could they have coagulopathy? Check, ask questions, beware. And this is another case, this is kind of the death adder. So most people think about snakebite in Australia, they think coagulopathy, neurotoxicity. And they almost use coagulopathy as a proxy for envenomation, because we've had this dominant story of the tiger and the brown snakes really leading the cause of death from snake bites, where they mostly have some degree of coagulopathy as a lead indicator, early, within hours, sign of snake bite. But the death adder, and this is actually a snake found outside of its normal range. This was a case from a snake keeper in Ballarat in Victoria, where you don't have death adders in the wild. So this patient presented, this was photographs from Royal Melbourne Hospital, where the patient ultimately ended up in the intensive care unit, given death adder antivenom. But the story is that if you're expecting coagulopathy as your sign of early snake bite, well, you won't ever see coagulopathy with most species of death adder. And if you're thinking, oh, that's the indicator of toxicity, and you don't see it, sometimes people can then not appreciate that this patient may go on to, within 5-10 hours, respiratory distress and asphyxiation from the pure neurotoxic death adder envenomation, which combines the pre-ends postsynaptic neurotoxins that can be a cause of death outside of the other issues with other types of snakebite. So be aware, you may not see this classic two front fangs of the bite site. You may see just little puncture marks or nothing much at all. This is a classic death adder bite site, but don't expect necessarily to see all those punctures or much puncture signs at all. Certainly you can get a wide variety, even with your tiger snakes, of what the bite site looks like. And I was rung about this patient by George Breitberg initially, because the hospital in Ballarat was telling him, who was kind of coordinating aeromedical retrievals, I think, on that Friday night, that the hospital didn't have any antivenom for the death adder. And this would not be unusual for a rural Victorian community that doesn't necessarily expect to have death adder bites in their community. But Ballarat has the wildlife park there that has death adders. So I was aware that the hospital should have death adder antivenom. He was saying, look, they don't seem to have it. So I spoke to the consultant there in the emergency department who was seeing this patient who had progression of neurotoxicity. And he said, no, there's no antivenom here. And turned out that patient was taken to Royal Melbourne Hospital where they had death adder antivenom. And yet that hospital did have, at that time, death adder antivenom, but they didn't have it in the emergency department fridge. They had that in the pharmacy department. So miscommunication by the emergency department staff about where was the stock of antivenom. And they just didn't talk to their pharmacist. Could have saved a trip down to Royal Melbourne Hospital. In the end, all went well, but just to highlight the fact that sometimes even the consultants may not know where the antivenom is and what type in a given hospital. This is a contrasting case from a regional centre. Mark Zagorski called me some time ago. We had to talk about this potential snakebite. Wasn't clear, but plausible story for snakebite. So he put the first aid, moved the patient on to a centre that had the appropriate antivenom. Lo and behold, no venom detected, nothing happened. And that is the case with so many just normal potential snake bites in Australia. Relatively dull for your clinician. But you have to do this because every now and then there will be a progressive severe case of snakebite. So no harm whatsoever in doing the appropriate first aid to get that patient safely moved to a centre that can assess and treat the patient if they progress to an envenomation syndrome. Sometimes there's no obvious history of snakebite, even though they are in venom. So to summarise, I guess, the picture of how to kill your snakebite patients, I'm just double checking. I've got a little message. No, sorry. Just some ways of highlighting here, I guess, very concisely, some of the lessons I've learned about how to kill a snakebite victim. Well, people may not even think this is a snakebite. And there have been patients admitted to hospital with complications of coagulopathy from snakebite, where nobody thought for 10 hours until one of the anaesthetists in the intensive care unit said, could this be snakebite? Inadequate first aid. We saw some examples of that. It's not stopping the clock effectively on the movement of venom. Or underappreciating the fact that when you remove the first aid, suddenly things may transform and change. So there was a patient from Rockhampton Hospital some years ago where this patient literally stepped on the snake out of a car, perfect first aid, fully stopped the clock on the movement of the venom, came into the emergency department, no signs of snakebite, no coagulopathy. Okay, let's take the first aid off. Straight away, the patient deteriorated. So be aware that venom can be very securely sequestered by this lymphatic compression and immobilization. So you be very careful that you're ready for things to change when you remove that first aid. Inadequate antivenom. Well, that's a debate in terms of the number of vials these days. It's an ongoing debate, but in the very least, people should be aware of what the principles are of when you give antivenom. Do not hesitate to give it when it's indicated. And talk to the experts. If you have any questions, any doubt, pick up the phone, 24/7, they're available. Inappropriate antivenom. Antivenom too late. Remembering that neurotoxicity can progress well down the track. So patients have died in Australia because there's not been an appreciation of the dynamic nature of the signs and symptoms, the complications. They put too much emphasis on the initial presentation where there may be nothing to see. But if you've got a purely neurotoxic venom like a death adder bite, 10 hours later, this patient may be in respiratory distress. And particularly in rural and regional Australia, you may not have antivenom, and it may be very difficult to get access to antivenom late at night when the flying doctor cannot come. You have to go overland, and you have the lack of staff. So very much do not underappreciate snakebite. Retrieve that person as soon as possible rather than too late. And there's not antivenom issues. You can have complications of snakebite where the issue is not more antivenom. So you can have neurotoxicity that's from the presynaptic neurotoxins that will not be budged because they destroyed the presynaptic membrane, will not be changed by the presence of more antivenom. What you need to do is support them appropriately, particularly manage their airway. so they don't asphyxiate until they recover those nerves. And they typically, severe cases, take a week or two for getting repair of that neurotoxicity, presynaptic neurotoxicity. Rhabdomyolysis can kill despite antivenom if it gets away and it's too severe. Microangiopathic hemolytic anemia, a complication of tiger snake bite, for example, that we don't fully understand, can be difficult to manage sometimes. The pre-hospital collapse, of course, is critical. The patient may have had critical events before they ever get to you. And then don't misunderstand that dynamics of when the neurotoxins cause their complications, the myotoxins and the procoagulants, because you can have resolving coagulopathy, but yet to have the severe neurotoxicity that may be the big problem for a particular snakebite, or the late onset rhabdomyolysis. So the severity or otherwise of the coagulopathy or the myotoxicity or the neurotoxicity is separate. You've got to monitor them all and go back again, because things change by the hour, even by the minute sometimes. And we've got multiple examples of how people have died in minutes from snakebite pre-hospital. They've died in the emergency department from complications, particularly coagulopathy problems, or they've died from late rhabdomyolysis or neurotoxicity complications in the hospital. So these are some examples. And I highlight the sea snake bite case here because sea snake are somewhat similar in its effects to the causes neurotoxicity and rhabdomyolysis, not much of a coagulopathy though. But that's a snake bite that can readily be shut down, if you like, by the use of pressure immobilization technique. So the most recent fatality was in the Northern Territory back in 2018, when it was a worker on one of these trawlers who was definitively bitten, but for some reason, the first aid didn't get appropriately placed or something went wrong. So that patient, I think, didn't even make it to Darwin. So do not underestimate the importance of early and effective complete first aid. And even Newcastle, deaths can occur in the backyard of Jeff Isbister, the guru of the Australian Snakebite Project. So to summarise, to reiterate, snakebite, if in doubt, seek advice. Definitive management is antivenom combined with intensive care management, monitoring, ancillary treatment, particularly for neurotoxicity, coagulopathy. So if you've got a suspicion, admit the patient, pick up the phone, seek advice, get the patient to where there is the laboratory facilities, the antivenom, the physician, nursing capacity to manage, to diagnose and manage the envenomation, its complications, including the possible anti-venom anaphylaxis. So the treatment itself, not without harm. So these antivenoms, typically pretty safe, pretty effective, a lot of use, but still the risk of a reaction to this foreign antigen, mostly horses, but as I've mentioned, so the funnel web spider antivenom made in rabbits, very low risk of acute allergic reaction, but some of the larger antivenoms, such as the polyvalent, the Taipan, and the tiger, seem to have more of a risk of an acute adverse reaction. The brown snake, much lower volume, less common, but still potentially there. So these are the snakes where we have antivenoms, and we have the polyvalent as well, and the sea snake antivenom. So when you're thinking about which snake antivenom to choose, depending on where you are, there's different advice. So Victorian recently has started up a trend of everybody who needs antivenom gets tiger brown combo. That covers your bases immediately. But in other parts of Australia, it's a bit more complicated, given that you've got any one of these type of snakes. So think about where you are, what are the snakes, think about the clinical features of your patient, which will help you decide which antivenom. And you can also use the snake venom detection kit, which I am a big fan of. It's a tool that's unique to Australia, helps you decide which antivenom to give, but it does not tell you to give antivenom. But there's some controversy about the risk of misinterpretation of what is potentially a very useful part of the envenomation management kit. Noting, of course, if you've got a patient who's got a history of horse allergy, high risk of an acute adverse reaction, but it's not a contraindication. This is just giving you a picture of where Australian snake bites here, with neurotoxic coagulopathic features, myotoxic features, but not so much the local cytotoxicity fit in comparison with other parts of the world where there's much more concern about myotoxicity and cytotoxicity. But they can also have some of these other problems. So this is another way of putting it, looking at the neurotoxins, the pro and anticoagulants, and the myotoxins, depending on which species. But if you look for coagulopathy, neurotoxicity, myotoxicity, in all your potential snakebite patients, that will cover it. The complication is that the initial neurotoxins tend to be simple blockers, on and off, blocking the postsynaptic nicotinic receptors. And they are followed by the slower destructive action of the presynaptic neurotoxins. And antivenom won't help you when that slower destructive action of the presynaptic phospholipase is happening. So you want to get in, monitor your patient for the earliest signs of that post-junctional receptor blockade, because that's the easiest to reverse with appropriate antivenom. And so you keep your eyes on the eyes, literally. And this is an example from Royal Melbourne Hospital of the complication of kind of the late treatment of a tiger snake bite, where this patient had a persisting ophthalmoplegia for months, which can occur. And of course, not to forget, the risks of collapse in the presence of severe coagulopathy, particularly the context of the procoagulant type coagulopathy, which is so prominent and problematic for tiger and taipan and tiger snake bites. Your mulga snake type bites tend to have the true anticoagulants, which are not so much of a problem. So part of the challenge is, what does a bite site look like? Is it painful, inflammatory? Not necessarily. This is a photograph from a newspaper article. No, it was from a media story, a television story about this bite of a sea snake, which was unrecognised by the child who was bitten and unrecognised initially by the ambulance staff and the treating clinicians in Western Australia. So don't necessarily expect a history of a snake bite. That's another little trick. Patient may tell you, well, I didn't see a snake at all. Couldn't be a snake bite. You still need to do the needful, to pick up the phone, seek advice in case of that risk. And this is where we get to September 11. So 2 stories of September 11 as we count down towards finishing the discussion here. So this gentleman was a snake expert, Joe Slawinski, died 2001, September. So here's a kind of poignant photograph of him, photographed on September 10, 2001, the day before he was bitten by a highly neurotoxic relation of our Australian snakes. And this guy was known for his work on the mountainous reptiles of Burma, Myanmar. And he was up there looking in remote locations for more of these reptiles, which he was an expert, American expert on. And this is a note that you can find online. In fact, there is a book about the story of this character and his death. Joe Slawinski, PhD in reptiles and herpetology. So this is kind of the story of how he was bitten in the remote northern mountains of Burma, and he was bitten at 7 a.m. on the 11th of September 2001. Whilst events were happening on the other side of the world, he was bitten by a snake, which he, as a snake expert, initially misidentified, and he ignored initially the snake bite. It was, in fact, this very dangerous neurotoxic Bungarus multicinctus, the multi-banded crate, known as a killer in Asia. And so this story was written down by a contemporary witness. Standing beside him when he was casually picked up this particular snake on the assumption that it was a non-toxic mimic. Remember that mimic story that we had from Queensland? On the assumption that this snake had already allegedly bitten his assistant who caught it with ill effect, no ill effects. Now, he immediately recognised, actually, his mistake, but he couldn't detect any abrasion. So he sat down to breakfast with no first aid. Could not detect an abrasion. So the same story we heard again and again with snakebite in Australia. And this is a snake expert. And he noticed, he had a nap, noticed a tingling in his muscles, and then they tried to get help. But it was a very remote location, ended up, couldn't. Later that day, respiratory distress, CPR, 26 hours of team CPR. Tried to get a helicopter. There he is, this gentleman, literally with his inadequate first aid from a highly dangerous neurotoxic snake. Remarkable how the expert had such inadequate first aid and ended up 24 hours or so later, respiratory support could not keep things going and he died. So even experts can make mistakes and be blasé about the risks. So don't underestimate, even though it looks like it's not a serious case, because the complications may come later. And do not underestimate the power of appropriate early first aid. Now, as it happened, I was called on September 11 by another snakebite, about another snakebite. I was called from Miami-Dade County in the United States. I wasn't called about the Burmese case. Obviously, nothing could be done there. It was an Australian snake. This was a case of a Papuan Taipan bite in Miami-Dade County, Florida. So we could spend time talking about this, but basically, Florida is a hotbed of exotic creatures. I'm not sure. I haven't seen the Joe Exotics documentary, but I suspect he's in Florida because it's a hotbed of exotic animals. And this guy was sorting as an importer exotic snake, a Papuan Taipan, was bitten by it on September 11. So the problem, of course, for him, he had a serious neurotoxic, coagulopathic, myotoxic Australasian snake bite, and they used up the Florida supply of CSL, polyvalent, and Taipan antivenom. And so he was, here's the bite site, wrapped up with a pressure bandage in the intensive care unit. He had a rip-roaring Taipan envenomation, and so they got on the only flight off over the United States on September 12th from West Coast to East Coast, antivenom, CSL antivenom. So he did well, but by coincidence, that was another potentially disastrous Australian snakebite in America on September 11. And I raised the Taipan allergy in the title. So I'll just mention, when is a Taipan bite not a Taipan bite? Well, I saw a patient in Royal Melbourne Hospital. I heard actually about it in the media before I saw that patient that day. He was bitten by an inland Taipan, so the most toxic snake in the world. And from the media story, I thought, okay, this guy's going to have a serious neurotoxic or myotoxic envenomation picture. I went into the emergency department, I saw him, and in fact, he was alive, well, talking, and had no antivenom. He had acute anaphylaxis to this Taipan bite. So he was a snake keeper, one of these classic characters, been bitten by other snakes before, had some allergic reactions, but had never been bitten by a Taipan. So there was all this expectation that the Taipan envenomation was going to be manifest as a really serious case of toxicity. But in fact, he had no toxicity. He had very mild local effects, but had this systemic anaphylactic reaction, which was well managed. Antivenom was not required. So not always is it a case that a serious, highly toxic snakebite is manifest as a toxic problem. And just in the last couple of minutes, so marine species, many things we could talk about there. The big killer, multi-tentacle Chironex fleckeri box jellyfish. We've got an excellent antivenom. Pressure immobilization is not relevant. Really, it's CPR and analgesia, which may be serious narcotic analgesia for these patients. And just to mention, the Irukandji syndrome is much smaller, tiny, four-tentacled type of box jellyfish rather than the 60-tentacled type of box jellyfish, which we know less about the venom. We don't have a specific antivenom, but we do know it causes something of a syndrome like the funnel web spider, with massive release of neurotransmitters because of a sodium channel toxin that facilitates particularly the release of noradrenaline, the sympathetic neurotransmitters, just like in the funnel web story. So this is a story actually from Thailand, just to illustrate that the story that I've brought to you of some of our venomous creatures, clearly when you've got Australians or yourself, indeed, travelling outside of Australia, things that we think of as quintessentially Australian, like the box jellyfish, actually, folks, these creatures if not the same species, certainly a very similar species with a similar toxic profile, are present in other parts of the world. So the Indo-Pacific, we have sea snakes, box jellyfish, irukandjis, these little jellyfish with the 4 tentacles. We also have the stonefish. So this child, an Australian Melbourne child, was stung and almost lethally envenomed off Comac in the Gulf of Thailand some years ago, more than 10 years ago. And the story here was of ultimately a successful story, but there was no antivenom available locally, and he had some local complications. There we are. This is photographs from when he presented, so like 10 days down the track, to Royal Children's Hospital in Melbourne. A lot of itching here, so you can again get an infiltration from the cellular immune response to the embedded tentacular foreign body material. So he had tremendous pain and itch from that secondary reaction, which is well treated with steroids topically and orally potentially. So he ended up with a complication that can occur. But the moral of the story was that his father, a journalist, really crusaded to improve the local public health signage and provision of things like vinegar stinger suits, so that people can know more locally, whether they're tourists or local peoples, about the hazard in their waters, as we do in Northern Australia, but was not typically present in Thailand. So there he is, 10 years, well, less than 10 years later, safely swimming. And so the story in Australia: stinger suits, stinger prevention by nets, vinegar, not pressure immobilization, and appropriate antivenom, or narcotic analgesia and magnesium in the case of Irukandji syndrome, this kind of jellyfish from Northern Australia. And we don't have time to talk about it, but in my travels, I was talking to some travel medicine doctors in South Africa about a case of theirs which came from Thailand, which was in fact the first case described of Irukandji syndrome in Thailand, of this unusual envenomation syndrome. And from time to time, there are potentially very dangerous stingray injuries. This is from Tasmania, the most recent fatality in Australia from a stingray wound. There it is. And more prosaically, you have these other ankle or thereabouts wounds from stinging fish, including stingrays, that potentially cause serious wound infections. So that's another story that I'd like to emphasise, that GPs, even rural GPs, may see quite commonly the infective complications of these marine wound injuries. And you can get all kinds of things like sponge injuries, the little spicules getting in there that need steroids. We'd spend all day on that. Funnel-web spiders, we talked about that. Redback spiders, local effects prominent, and simple analgesia, oral analgesia, and then maybe redback spider antivenom, which is pretty safe and effective for most people. Just to say, even today in the 21st century, we find new species of dangerous snake. So this is a photograph of a putative new species of Taipan that was discovered in Western Australia. Good news is Taipan antivenom seems to work. There we are, 21st century, didn't even know we had another species of Taipan. So I'll just go to the Q&As. Centipedes. Are centipedes poisonous? Potentially venomous, but in Australia, painful. The stings are not a cause of lethal envenomation. But certainly the centipedes in Asia can be quite toxic. Lyme disease, well, that's another topic that we could spend time on. I guess the controversy you probably all know about is that in North America, hard-body ticks can harbour this vector of Lyme disease, this little spirochete. Is it here in Australia? Well, people have looked hard for the exact spirochete, haven't found that in Australian ticks, but have found other spirochetes. Could it be that there is a Lyme-type disease? It's not exactly the same. I think it's quite plausible. That is a subject of active research, a lot of debate with the Commonwealth Health Department. Certainly we know that tick-borne infection is a potential killer in Australia. So these ticks do carry infections. They do carry spirochetes. It's quite plausible, but as yet we can't call it Lyme disease. Sea snakes, very uncommon. Fishermen, children, no deaths in Australia of until in the last 100 years, really, until that case of that trawler fisherman So unique issues for retrieval. Well, it's another neurotoxic snake bite, and that's the problem that can kill these patients rapidly. Days later, they could have myotoxicity. The last death of an Australian child was actually in Malaysia, in I think the late 50s, early 60s, and that child died not of neurotoxicity but of rhabdomyolysis. Death out of Western Victoria. Well, they used to be, not that we know of anymore. There is a species of snake called the bardic, which looks somewhat like a death adder. Reacts, it seems, somewhat similarly to the death adder in the Venom kit, but we haven't had death adders as such in the Victoria as a native species for 100 years. But certainly death adders repeatedly turn up in all parts of Victoria with snake keepers. There's another question from David, or comment, Russell's viper, commonest cause of death from snake bite. I haven't got the last part of your comment there. Okay, here we are. Spent 7 years in Bangladesh. Yes, indeed. Very dangerous snake in Asia. So we are fortunate people who have exotic, dangerous snakes legitimately in the zoos these days tend to have very few problems. Historically, a few decades ago, there were multiple exotic snake bites, not from Russell's viper, but certainly from rattlesnakes, cobra snakes in different zoos, Taronga Zoo, Melbourne Zoo, and the Ballarat Wildlife Park, amongst others. So that's kind of another and interesting area, the exotic snake bites. But if you have an exotic snake bite from one of these zookeepers, still you're looking for neurotoxicity, myotoxicity, local complications, and the possibility of rhabdomyolysis. But you need to pick up the phone, talk to your local experts, your national experts, if you need to access some of these zoo-associated antivenoms. Someone send me a message? No. Okay. So, let's see whether there's anyone. Okay. Cross-reactivity between Australia and other countries' snake venom. Yes, interesting question. Essentially, the story seems to be that our snakes are very closely related to the kraits out of Asia. Those small fangs at the front of the mouth that are not foldable, containing snakes. So that's what the Australian dangerous snakes are. These so-called elapid snakes with the small fixed fangs at the front of the mouth, just like the Asian kraits, just like cobras in Asia and in Africa. So there's similarity there. There are common antigens. And indeed, there's a possibility that we can use the tiger snake antivenom for the treatment of some of these. And there's been laboratory work around that question over many years. So I think there's kind of, at least in that area, there's a common evolutionary ancestor. But there certainly is, throughout the world, convergence of toxins on the postsynaptic nicotinic acetylcholine receptor that reflects convergent evolution, because it's a very significant receptor to block. Anti-gal antibodies from Mark. Bushwalks in Queensland. I grew up in Queensland. Fortunately, I avoided the issue. Are mammal-derived antivenom safe? Very interesting question. I have thought that this may be one of the reasons why we do get, in people who have no prior exposure to horses or antivenom, acute adverse reactions. Maybe it's got to do with those anti-gal type antibodies in patients such as yourself, who are then reacting to the horse, and they're mostly horse antibodies. But we don't know the answer to that. But absolutely we know that venom, anti-venom allergy is not a contraindication to the use of antivenoms. So you should regard yourself as safe, but absolutely you want to take care to prevent snake bite so you don't run that gauntlet of that particular problem. So Sandra asks, how far up the leg do you compress? All the way to the trunk. For the arm, for the leg, go from the tip of the toes or the tip of the fingers all the way to the trunk. I'd go past the upper knee, absolutely, because you need to be compressing the maximum lymphatics, combining that with splint, combining with that with immobilization of the patient. The initial studies when this was developed in the late 70s, early 80s, certainly suggested if you do not have full limb compression, full limb immobilization, and immobilization of the whole patient, you will inevitably push some venom into the circulation. So you want to really try and do the maximum amount of compression and immobilization, except for what else would be done before antivenom is given. Well, you want to do the full neurotoxic survey. You particularly want to be vigilant about the cranial nerves, the eye signs, and looking for any non-specific features of envenomation, lymphadenopathy. Certainly check the urine, and if check access to the IV access for the patient, check what antivenoms you have, and certainly if they need talking about whether you can get the patient to a centre that has better intensive care. Sometimes these regional centres, obviously, it's just you and the one nurse maybe at the best. So in the Northern Territory, as I understand it, all patients in the country are taken into Darwin because even if you had some antivenom, you don't have the capacity to manage the complications of things like Taipan bites or the coagulopathy, serious coagulopathy from brown snake bites. So really think about whether you need to retrieve the patient sooner rather than later if you have any question of contingency or constraint on your ability to monitor that patient and treat that patient and the complications of that patient. Antibiotics. Generally, we don't recommend on-spec antibiotics for snakebite patients. And certainly even with your marine wounds, unless you've got a patient, say, who's diabetic, steroids, some kind of immunocompromised, you're worried about Vibrio, then you want to be more aggressive. But if you've got any delay in wound debridement, cleaning, any question of wound infection, particularly when you're thinking about Vibrios in the context of the immunocompromised, the diabetic patient, want to be thinking about appropriate antibiotics, particularly the tetracyclines, and talk to your poison centre or your infectious disease physician about if you've got a patient where you think you've got an infective complication there. But generally, run-of-the-mill snake bite and most of your bite and sting patients, you don't need that. Other parts of the world, you might be a bit more aggressive about that. But certainly Australia, uncommon complication. But always think about tetanus status. Is it reasonable to cut a window in the pressure bandages? Yes, absolutely. Because you've got the rest of that compression and immobilization working for you. Described for snakebite first aid. Well, basically, you can have a look at the links, but basically it's a firm compression bandage from the tip of the limb, the fingers, just leaving the tips out so you can check the capillary return, all the way to the trunk. Combine that with splinting, combine that with immobilization of the patient. And you really want to have compression that blocks the lymphatics, but it's not a tourniquet. So it really needs to be firm. Maybe you can get one finger underneath it. It should not be uncomfortable for the patient, but it should be firm. Tetanus, yes, always think of tetanus status. You don't need to give it if the patient's tetanus status is up to date. Some good courses to learn about envenomation. Well, I mentioned the Women's and Children's Hospital in Adelaide, Julian White, they run courses there. Many of the emergency medicine pre-hospital management courses, St. John Ambulance, the MCOR team and others also incorporate envenomation management. Copy of the presentation, I think it's being recorded. I'm not recording it, but I think the college is, and you can get that available. How do carbonated snakes still bite? Well, they still have a biting reflex there. Don't ask me the neuroanatomy, but it still happens. So there's venom still present. And indeed, you can be envenomed in principle by snake from a totally dead snake where you have the fangs. So taxidermied venomous snakes are a bit of a risk because the dried venom still can be active. And we did some venom studies to look at some, not hundreds of years old, tens of decades old snake venom was still immunologically active and had some trace of the active toxins. So they're pretty stable snake venom toxins. If some venom transmitted by lymphatic, what is the point for compression? Well, the compression is of the lymphatic channels, the low pressure channels. It's not compressing the arterial and venous circulation. So it's kind of 45, 55 millimeters mercury. So it's not painful or uncomfortable for the patient, but it should be firm. When's the best time to remove the bandage? After you've fully assessed the patient, signs, symptoms, laboratory investigations, have IV access, have access to any venom. So be ready for things to change. Most of the time it won't, but more than once, patients have had rapid decompensation once the pressure immobilization has been removed, because there's been a bolus of venom that has then moved fairly quickly to the central circulation. And the big problem is the procoagulants that may precipitate a cardiovascular collapse. Smart badge. Okay, yes, I do recommend the lymphatic compression bandages that have the rectangle, which helps you be aware that you've got the correct pressure there. Spider bite. How long does envenomation take place? Good question. The answer is different for your funnel web or your redback. So your redback, it's not a rapid fulminant envenomation syndrome. So the patient has initially may not even notice the bite, but then over hours, maybe days, patient pain may build up at the site, progress over the limb. They may get features of headache, insomnia, myalgias, paresthesias, small risk of a complication with myocarditis, but that's very unusual. But most of the time, it's about local pain that progresses over hours to days. And so that's in contrast to the funnel web, which also, they both have neurotoxins, but the funnel web spider has a neurotoxin that binds to the presynaptic neuronal sodium channel and seems to keep the channel open to facilitate the release of particularly the sympathetic neurotransmitter. So within 2 hours, the funnel web spider bite patient should be sweating, fasciculating, feeling very anxious and unwell as the sympathetic neurotransmitters surge through the body, and they can get hypertensive, which may be dangerously hypertensive. So as these patients can get intracerebral, high intracerebral pressures. Interestingly, so they can die initially from that intracerebral pressures, or they have a secondary risk when they've released all their sympathetic neurotransmitters, and the patient then, basically the blood pressure drops. They may get a cardiogenic pulmonary edema as they're basically exhausted their sympathetic neurotransmitters. So that can occur a day or two down the track. But usually in your child or your adult female, and those are the causes, those are the patients who've died from funnel webs, it's within 2 hours you see whether there's a progression. So if your patient presents to you more than 2 hours after a bite from a big black hairy spider in the eastern seaboard of Australia, and they've got no signs and symptoms, particularly if it's an adult, then very low risk of that's going to be a funnel web toxicity. Whitetail, cause for concern? Well, most of the time, local pain, inflammation, and that's it. A lot of debate about whether there's more to it, but for most patients, that's it. But any patient who's got any kind of bite and sting where they may have an underlying immunocompromise, there's a risk of a complicating infection or inflammatory reaction that is more than the simple venom story that we see in the laboratory with the whitetail spider. So we certainly have had a story in the past, which we published in the Medical Journal of Australia, about some legitimate inflammatory reactions to the whitetail spiders, but for most patients, not much to worry about. Okay, just looking through. When's the best time to remove the bandage? Okay, we've talked about that. Talked about the spider bites. How long after the redback spider can antivenom be given? Well, the thing is that patients may not initially complain that much. So typically you can give it as soon as you've tried local analgesia, maybe oral analgesia, and if they have progression of pain, or they've come in and they had the bite yesterday. So you can give it within hours, and sometimes it can be given as late as a couple of days. It seems to be a venom that persists, and many patients have had relief even a couple of days after the bite of redback spider, particularly when they've got insomnia and progressive regional pain. Box jellyfish, vinegar. No, it has not been withdrawn. Okay. When you say horse allergy, do you mean yes, hay fever type symptoms when exposed to horses, or of course, if they have an anaphylactic reaction from that horse exposure. So any kind of sensitivity there may put them at that higher risk of a reaction to the horse antibody-based antivenoms. Not much research done on that, but it's a general comment. Okay, Ambulance Victoria, recent case, 8-year-old snakebite, a lot of pain from the bandage. Well, it's possible they put too much pressure, particularly for a child. Maybe. So you need to, particularly with children, make sure it's firm but not uncomfortable for the patient. Sorry, I just lost that next question. I think we're getting towards the end here. Snakebite, how do you best take a sample from the bite site for the test kit? Well, someone mentioned that if you've got the compression on, then you can cut a little window out, as has historically been recommended by CE Cell, or you can actually test the urine. That's kind of second best because the highest concentration of venom is at the bite site. At third best is the blood, but the highest concentration at the bite site can take a window out of the pressure bandage. Sometimes you literally do not know where the bite site is. The patient has got the symptoms and it's not clear from the history. There was no obvious bite. There was an exposure, maybe in a child outside, became unwell, very clear features of snakebite, in which case I would really be going straight away for urine, which is pretty robust for the detection of venom, but not as high a signal as you get from the bite site. Okay, allergic reaction with hives after insect bite, would recommend steroid usage. Potentially, but you want to be just be careful with which amount of steroid you're using. Venom at the site without envenomation. Indeed, you can detect venom positive snakebite, but that is not an indication to giving antivenom. Absolutely. And like with the patient I mentioned, the rough scale snakebite, initially you might think actually this is a negative test, but in fact there's so much venom it's saturated the antibodies in the test. So the venom detection test is another story, but usually you get a good signal that's within the range, but the signal positivity does not mean envenomation. And you can still have venom actually detected in the urine, and that is not necessarily an indication for antivenom because they may have very small quantities that do not cause clinical features that justify antivenom. To start pressure bandages proximally or distally? Good question. There's a lot of background story there, but basically the Australian Resuscitation Council recommendation is distal to proximal, covering the entire limb. Yes, theoretically you may push some venom centrally, but that's more comfortable than compressing from the center distally, where you may actually get venous congestion. And if the patient starts to move their limb, that will render less effective the first aid. What else? Down here, I think, okay, looks like we're in a loop here. I've gone through, I think, pretty much everybody's questions. I'll just stop sharing, hand over to Amy. I think we've gone well over time.
Thank you so much, Ken. That was fascinating. I think I speak for everyone when that was so interesting. Thank you so much for sharing. And just to conclude this evening, I just want to say RACGP Rural would like again to thank our sponsor, Okra Health and Recruitment. And just want to say thank you to our attendees for joining us this evening. And just a reminder to complete the evaluation form that'll pop up in the new window just once the webinar session closes. It'll take no more than a minute to complete. And also certificates of attendance will become available on your CPD statements within the next few days. But for any non-RACGP members who would like a certificate of attendance, please email us at rural@racgp.org.au. And that concludes this evening. Thank you, everyone, and good night.
Thank you.